Reflections. Reflecting the graph of f of x across the x-axis is given by negative f of x. So here we have the graph x minus 2 squared, and here we have negative x minus 2 squared. Reflecting the graph of f of x across the y-axis is given by f of negative x. So in red we have x minus 2 squared, and in blue we have negative x minus 2 squared, which is also x plus 2 squared. Reflecting the graph of f of x across the x-axis is given by negative f of x. If we start with f of x equals x minus 2 squared, g of x equals negative f of x, or negative x minus 2 squared. So we start with this parabola, and we end up with this parabola beneath the x-axis. Reflecting the graph of f of x across the y-axis is given by f of negative x. So we start with f of x equals x minus 2 squared, f of negative x equals negative x minus 2 squared, or x plus 2 squared. And you can see how this f of x graph has been reflected across the y-axis. Let f of x equal 6x minus x squared. The functions g and h are given by g of x equals negative f of x, and h of x equals f of negative x. Sketch the graphs of g of x and h of x on the grid to the right. Write formulas for g and h that do not involve the function f. Alright, so let's start with rewriting the formulas. So if g of x equals negative f of x, we have g of x equals negative f of x, which is 6x minus x squared. So when we distribute that negative sign in, we get x squared minus 6x. That's g of x. For h of x, we have h of x equals f of negative x. So we start with this, and we plug in negative x everywhere we see x, minus negative x squared. So that equals negative 6x minus x squared. And so that's our new h of x. Now, if we want to plot some points, let's start with g of x. If we have 0 as x, that gives us 0. So we still have a point here at the origin. If we plug in 1 here, we get 1 minus 6, which is negative 5. So let's down here. If we plug in 3, we would get 9 minus 18, which is negative 9, down here. All right, and let's plug in 6 here. 36 minus 36 gives us 0. So look, we have our parabola. I can draw that nicer. Parabola like this. I'm not very good at drawing these lines. All right, there we go. Now let's draw h of x. So if we plug in 0 for x, we also have a point at the origin. Let's try negative 3. So negative 3 in here, that would be 18 minus 9, which is 9. So that's a point right here. If we plug in negative 6, we would get negative 6 times negative 6 is 36 minus 36, which is 0. So look, we have our parabola right here, like that. Cool. All right, so we're correct there, and we have our g of x underneath there. There we go. Let f of x equal the absolute value of x minus 0.75x plus 1. The functions g and h are given by g of x equals negative f of x and h of x equals f of negative x. Sketch the graphs and write formulas. Let's write the formulas first. So we have g of x, which equals negative f of x. So we have negative and then everything in here. So absolute value of x minus 0.75x plus 1. So we can distribute that negative sign. We get negative absolute value of x plus 0.75x minus 1 as our g of x. And our h of x equals f of negative x. So we're going to take everything in here and plug in negative x instead. So we have absolute value of negative x minus 0.75 negative x plus 1, which equals the absolute value of, well, that's just going to cancel out. So we have the absolute value of x minus 0.75, plus 0.75x plus 1. So here's our new h of x. Now, if we're going to plot some points, we can just plug in some values and see what we get. Here we have, if we put in 0 for x, we would get 0, 0, negative 1. So this will be one of our points, our y-intercept. If we put in 1 here, we would get negative 1 plus 0.75 minus 1. So that would be negative 2 plus 0.75, so negative 1.25. So that would be negative 1.25. That's going to be here. All right, so if we put in negative 1, we would get, so negative 1 would be positive 1, but then negative again. So negative 1 minus 0.75 minus 1. So that would be negative 2.75 here. All right, so this is looking like this. All right, now let's do h of x. So if we put in 0 for x, we get 1 right here. If we put in 1 for x, we get 1 plus 0.75 plus 1, so that's 2.75. So that's here. If we put in 2, we would get 2 plus 1.5 plus 1, so that would be 3 plus 450. Okay, 450 is up here. If we put in negative 1, that would become positive 1. So negative 1 becomes positive 1, and then negative 0.75 plus 1. So, yeah, this would become negative here. So 1 minus 0.75 plus 1 becomes 1.25. So that's a negative 1, 1.25 is here. If we put in negative 2, we would get positive 2 minus 1.5 plus 1. So 2 minus 1.5 is 0.5 plus 1 is 1.5. So that's here. All right, so this is looking like that. All right, so let's check out our answer. Oh, first let me click this. All right, so my drawing's a little off, but yeah, about right. And we have our formulas. G of x equals negative x plus 0.75x minus 1. And we have an h of x, value of absolute value of x plus 0.75x plus 1.